Welcome to this lesson. This is food chains and ecosystems, and obviously while it seems very similar to the stuff that we have been doing previously, and it is, it's technically part of a new chapter if you're following the same syllabus as us. It's chapter 13, energy and ecosystems. So today we're going to go through the food chains and ecosystems bit, and I'm imagining this is going to be quite a bit of revision for you from your GCSEs. So do expect that, but don't get complacent because, of course, as you know, you've got to be able to lift that language up to A-level standard and be able to explain these terms as an A-level student would. Okay, so cracking straight on, let's have a look at what the syllabus says. So our syllabus says that we are looking at energy and ecosystems, as it says A-level only. There's a lot of terminology here, okay? So we've got the synthesis of organic compounds from carbon dioxide, more on that in the photosynthesis chapter. We've got respiratory substrates, and then molecules being passed up through food chains and ecosystems, and how we measure those, okay? So the concept of biomass, the concept of calorimetry, and the chemical energy stored in biomass, and how we measure that. Okay, so also there's a part in this which talks about appreciating the way in which productivity, the bits that are added into an ecosystem, are affected by farming practices designed to increase efficiency. Now, of course, you should already have watched the last series of videos, the conservation conversations, for more on this, so we're not going to spend an awful lot of time on this, but the summary there, of course, is simplifying food webs and food chains in human food production. That means that there are fewer respiratory losses and more energy gets to us. I particularly recommend Nat Page's, the UK and Transylvania message if you want to learn about farming. Okay, so this is a very, very vocabulary heavy topic. What I want you to do is have next to you a pen and a paper to make a glossary. Okay, every time we come across a key term, and I will point them out, and there are a lot, I want you to write it down and write an A-level definition and get the detail in there. And I will try as best I can to point out specifically what makes this different from what you understand of a GCSE. Okay, so make sure that you've got all the words and that you can explain them in A-level standard. Okay, and we'll recap the list of words I think you should know at the end of the lesson. So, first one is quite clearly an ecosystem. Now, this is often a 2-mark question. What is an ecosystem? Okay, and an answer something along these lines. So it's a group of living organisms interacting is half of it, and the non-living things. So you can phrase that as biotic and abiotic factors. So the biotic, the animals and the abiotic factors they're living with. Okay, and the relationships between them, but don't leave out the non-living things. That's what takes this from GCSE up to A-level standard. Okay, so you could be talking, when you say an ecosystem, about an enormous one. You could be talking about the entire Arctic. You could be talking about a massive African savanna system there, or you could be talking about your garden pond as an ecosystem. Right? It's any group of living organisms on any scale, and the abiotic factors around them and their interactions. Okay, so that's ecosystem. That's the first one. Make sure you've written it down and got what would be a 2-mark A-level answer. You see how the pattern goes. So what's in an ecosystem? Let's get smaller, okay, in terms of the words. Okay, we've got the components of an ecosystem. So we've got habitat. That's obviously the place where an organism lives. So the organism's habitat is where it lives and the environment around it. Okay, so as you can see there, we've got the habitat there. Population, when we're talking about population, we're talking about all of the organisms of one species. Okay, so you might say population of, in this sort of river system here, you might say the population of fish, the population of carp or whatever it might be. Okay, population of plants, of bulrushes that live by the side of the river. Okay, so population is all of the organisms of one species who live in the same place at the same time and can breed together. You remember the species definition. If they can't breed together, we don't say they're necessarily a species. Then one slightly bigger than that is a community. Now, a pond community or river community is all the populations of different species that live in the same place and interact. Okay, so while you might have a population of bulrushes and a population of minnows, for example, when you put those things together, what you've got is a river community or a freshwater aquatic community. Okay, and when you put the abiotic stuff in there, you've got an ecosystem. Okay, so those are first 4 words: habitat, population, community, and ecosystem. Moving on quickly, do feel free, of course, to pause and make sure you write these down, get the correct definitions. So energy and ecosystems goes like this. Now this should be an obvious point to make, but it is an important one. That matter is constantly recycled within an ecosystem. That's why you've studied a little bit of nutrient cycles. Right? Maybe you've done that bit at A level already, but you've certainly done that at GCSE. So at GCSE you will have done the carbon cycle and the water cycle, and at A level you do the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. And again, have a look at the Conservation Conversations videos for real world examples of where humans messing with the nutrient cycles can cause problems, particularly nitrogen cycle, eutrophication, that kind of stuff. So nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle are really good examples. Matter constantly has to be recycled, and we can push it around from different place to different place. Energy, however, is not. Energy is not recycled. Ultimately, the first source of energy is the sun, and that energy basically flows through, gets captured, some of it gets captured into life, and eventually it ends up as heat radiating off into space. Okay. Now the extent of this recycling is amazing, right? And there are some facts and figures which obviously are quite out there as far as facts and figures go, but they do make sense. The idea of recycling is really important, because if stuff didn't die, there wouldn't be things breaking down, and there wouldn't be atoms to build the next generation of organisms. Okay, so obviously, you know, this gets us into Disney characters, doesn't it? You know, when we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eats the grass, and we're suddenly in the Lion King, and then we're all singing. But let's not do that. So another good example of this is the idea that you, as a pile of atoms, right, you as a human, are made of a lot of the same atoms that people before you have been made of. So you can say with a fair degree of statistical certainty that in your body is at least one atom from any historical figure you would care to mention, right? Shakespeare, Hitler, Jesus, Gandhi, whatever, right? Just, you know, obviously there are some atoms that turn over more quickly in your body and some atoms don't, but you are constantly taking in new atoms in the food that you eat and getting rid of atoms in terms of your hair, your waste products, your skin cells. So the turnover of atoms in your body is quite large. So I have heard it said that you might think your first memory was from when you were 2 years old, because you were there, right? That was you had the experience at 2. By the time you're an adult, actually the pile of atoms that was you when you were 2 is not predominantly the same pile of atoms as you now. So you think you had that memory because you were there, but the you that is you now, the pile of atoms that makes up your body, wasn't there, right? Because of this constant cycling of matter, which is a bizarre thought. And the only thing that stayed the same is the pattern of connections in your brain. It's a strange sort of existential thought, that. Similarly, the idea that if we got all the people on the planet together somehow who'd ever existed, right, everyone who's ever existed, got them all together, the biomass of all those people would be larger than the size of the Earth itself, which gives you a sort of feel of how much recycling of matter there has to be. Okay, energy, however, as we said, flows through an ecosystem, and eventually, so the solar radiation comes in, and eventually, either through life or not through life, it gets radiated back out into space. Okay. So, how does energy enter the ecosystem? Well, of course, ultimately, if you trace it back, the source of all energy on the planet is the sun. Okay, and here are more words that you have to know. Again, talking about GCSE knowledge, you should know these. Right, we've got the producers, the herbivores, and the carnivores. Okay, so a producer is anything that largely does photosynthesis. There are exceptions to this. Again, at A level, we can start talking about those exceptions. But for the vast majority of the planet, the producers are doing photosynthesis in some way. If you go into deep caves or down to the bottom of the sea, you might find these things called chemoautotrophs that are manufacturing biological molecules or high energy molecules from the energy in chemical reactions, usually coming from geological functions, and not using the sun at all. But that's obscure, right? So largely we're talking about producers being photosynthetic organisms, plants, algae, whatever it might be. And about 2/3 of the photosynthesis on the planet is done in the sea, done by algae, and about 1/3 on the land. Okay, which kind of makes sense when you think about the amount of the surface of the Earth that is land. So producers produce biological molecules from inorganic molecules using the energy of the sun and photosynthesis. Herbivores are things that can only eat plants. And let's be very specific about this. When we say herbivores, we mean things whose digestive system is adapted anatomically, physiologically, to only consume plant matter. Okay, and carnivores, something that an organism that's carnivorous, similarly, its digestive system could not eat a plant-based diet. Okay, herbivores could not subsist on meat. Okay, if you have a digestive system that's adapted to do both, you should know that you are an omnivore. Okay, there's not it's not an element of choice. You can't choose to be a herbivore or choose to be a carnivore. That's often a confusion that generally happens at GCSE. Most people have got them at A level. If you are vegetarian, you are not a herbivore. You are still an omnivore. If you basically eat meat all day, every day, and I really don't recommend you do that, you are not a carnivore. You are still an omnivore. Okay? So it's about anatomy. It's about physiology, and that's the specificity you need at A level, right? The animal, the herbivore, can only eat plant material, not chooses to or just does. Okay, and carnivores similar with meat. So if we go along again, more words that should be familiar to you. The idea that you've got this idea of herbivores generally being primary consumers. A primary consumer means the first consumer. Primary consumers eat producers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, and you can go on quaternary consumers, but for reasons we'll get to a little bit later, maybe another lesson to do with energy, you rarely in a food chain get quaternary and then further consumers, because you simply run out of energy at that length of food chain. Okay, and then you've got detritivores in there. So this is food chain. Obviously, though it's a cycle, we know these things are cycles. Shows how energy is transferred from one living organism to another. And each level we refer to as a trophic level. Trophic literally means feeding. Okay, so if you see troph on the end of anything, then like so, heterotroph, phototroph, chemotroph, autotroph. Troph means feeding. So a trophic level is a feeding level. Okay, so then of course you've got the detritivores in there, which deal with all the waste products, break down things, dead organisms, that kind of stuff, and return the atoms there either into the air to be taken in the form of carbon dioxide by the primary producers, or into the soil to be taken up as minerals, your nitrates, your phosphates, that kind of stuff. Okay, so detritivores, and of course the one that's missing from there is the decomposers. Detritivores, decomposers, slightly different, but you get the idea. Okay, so we've got primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. You can have quaternary consumers if you want. Detritivores, detritivores, and then trophic levels, carnivores, herbivores, omnivores. Okay, lots and lots of keywords. Okay, and make sure you're getting them specific, please. Of course, as well, it's not as simple as that. You have to work quite hard in nature to find a single food chain where one organism only eats one organism, only eats one organism, only eats one organism, because that's really, really, really vulnerable. If something happens to one organism in that chain, everything above it dies. Okay, everything higher up the food chain dies. So most animals diversify. Okay, so food webs are a much better way of representing the relationships within ecosystems. Okay, so as it says there, living organisms are usually members of more than one food chain and often feed on different trophic levels. So important point there, just because you're a primary consumer doesn't mean you can't also be a secondary or tertiary consumer. Humans are omnivores and can be both primary, secondary and tertiary consumers. Okay, so they can eat all sorts of different things. Right. I would note as well here the arrows, in case you're going to do the old primary school trick of drawing an arrow that shows eats the. We don't do lion eats the, gazelle eats the grass, because then we'd have to go eats the sun. Not really. The arrows, as you should know, and this is basic stuff, show the flow of energy. They show the movement of energy through an ecosystem. Okay, so drawing the food chains obviously helps us understand energy flow through an ecosystem much better, because if you've got all these relationships going on here, then if you, for example, started to get rid of, I don't know, if you got rid of the snakes, okay, you got rid of the snakes, then you would have an increase in the frog population, a decrease in the buzzard population, an increase in the titmouse population, and then an increase in berries. Increase the bird, decrease the berries, and you'd have knock-on impacts. So food webs are much more useful than just single food chains in understanding what's actually going on. Okay, so that's really important to get your head around. Okay. And there are all sorts of weird and wonderful examples of where one organism has been removed from an ecosystem and it's had a massive impact on a huge knock-on chain. And again, go and listen to Dan Hammerschlag's Conservation Conversation, the bit where he talks about removing large predators and rewilding in Yellowstone, and how that actually not only affected the biotic, but actually moved the rivers. So wolves moved rivers via their effect on food webs, which obviously is a fantastic example of what we're talking about. So, efficiency, and the next lesson in this week is on efficiency calculations and energy transfer. Again, I shouldn't need at A-level standard to tell you how to do percentage calculations or do things like this, basic stuff. Okay, but I would advise you, look at the numbers. Is that sensible? Okay, does it look like it's about 50%, efficient? Does it look like it's whatever you've worked out? If something's more than 100% efficient, you've obviously done something stupid. Do it again. Okay? So, efficiency of energy transfer. Not very much. Okay? So, the sun produces a massive amount of energy. Okay? And that energy hits the earth in huge quantities. The sun is unimaginably energetic. And if we could capture that energy, we could serve our energy needs globally indefinitely. I think the case is if we managed to take a 300 square mile patch of the Sahara, which isn't hugely big, and capture every bit of sun that hit that bit of ground and turn that into electricity, we would serve the needs of the entire population, right, forever, right, literally forever. So obviously, very, very attractive prospect that, but solar technology isn't there. Plants are not very efficient. They're efficient enough. They're pretty good. Photosynthesis is an amazing system, but it isn't perfect. Okay. So for every 1,000 joules of light energy that hits the plant, 990 is lost to the environment. Okay, meaning only 10 joules ends up in growth that a herbivore can then eat, that is accessible to the next trophic level. Okay, so they consume all that. Of that, 9 joules is lost to the energy. 9 joules of energy is lost to the environment in various different ways, and only 1 out of the original 1,000 is available to our carnivore. Okay, so it's really not very, and obviously the carnivore has to run around and chase that and grab that, so it's losing lots of energy as well. So only 0.1 joule of that energy actually makes it into the body, the biomass of the carnivore. Okay, so very inefficient. So each trophic level, energy is lost. It's unavailable to the next organism. We call these just respiratory losses. At GCSE, you might have got away with talking about movement and respiration and keeping warm, and all of these things at A level are just the respiratory losses. Yeah, we lump them all together. Okay, so they'll get you A mark. You can't have movement and keeping warm and like you might have done at GCSE. No, you've got to be more high level than that. So these are all called respiratory losses. Another place where they're lost, obviously, are in dead organisms and waste material. So when an organism dies and it's consumed by decomposers, that energy is lost to the food chain, to the top predators. Waste material, so animals' waste products do have a energy value. It's why lots of places can burn dry dung, that kind of stuff, and get an energy value out of it. It's why dung beetles exist, because there is an energy value in waste products. Okay. And not all of the organism is eaten. So, for example, when the deer there is going to eat and I have no idea where in the world this is, because that looks like a moose and a lion in the same place. No idea where we are here, probably a zoo. But the moose, the deer there, isn't going to eat, the herbivore isn't going to eat the roots, for example, and eat every single bit of that plant. And the lion isn't going to eat the bones and the antlers and the fur of the herbivore. Okay? So we've got respiratory losses, we've got waste materials, we've got indigestible materials as well. Next, so the old famous pyramids of biomass you might have been aware of at GCSE. These are pyramids that basically give us a visual representation of how much energy is moving up a food chain. Okay, they show the dry mass, right, in grams per meter squared of all organisms at each trophic level at a given time, which represents the chemical potential energy stored in the organic matter. Now, the reason we use dry mass, to basically exclude water, is water has a mass, but it has no energy value to it. Okay, you don't get any calories from drinking water. So let's say you ate, I don't know, let's say you were a whale going around the sea and you ate however many kilos of jellyfish, you're not going to get much energy out of those compared to a kilo of shrimp or krill, because the jellyfish is predominantly water. Okay, so there's very little chemical potential energy in there. So the chemical potential energy within the biomass, that's what we're interested in. When we're talking about productivity and we're talking about building a pyramid of biomass, we're interested in that. Okay, right, moving on then. Now, as you may remember, a GCSE question that you might have done as a practice question, which showed this. It was like the A-star grade 9 question, which showed an inverted pyramid of biomass. And this is an examiner's favourite trick, because when you look at aquatic environments, you get this ebb and flow, you get this rise and fall of biomass throughout the year. So there are some points in the year where zooplankton consume phytoplankton. So that zooplankton, it literally means plankton that are like little animals, as opposed to phytoplankton that are plankton that are little plants. So zooplankton consume the phytoplankton so rapidly that actually the zooplankton biomass is bigger than the producer. So our primary consumer is bigger than our producer's bar, and you do get that so it looks like that. Okay, in grams per meter squared. Now that, of course, is only a temporary situation. Eventually, the zooplankton will starve and their numbers will go down. And then the next year, when the phytoplankton numbers go up, so will the zooplankton. Okay, but it's an examiner's favourite, one of their favourite tricks, to take that snapshot where the biomass pyramid looks wrong, looks upside down, and give you questions based on that. Okay, so at certain times of the year, zooplankton consume phytoplankton so rapidly the biomass of zooplankton is greater than the phytoplankton. Bear that in mind if you get an aquatic question, a marine biology based question. So in terms of biomass, right, what do we mean by that term? It's a key term. Well, it's the total mass of living material in a specific area at a specific time. And it's those last bits, specific area, specific time, that give you that extra level in your answer that we're looking for here. Okay, so fresh mass, that's quite easy to assess. So you go in, you want to know how much mass there is in terms of an environment. You might take a sample, so you use small samples that might be representative. You might just weigh that and go, okay, well, one sort of little tree weighs this much, so I know there are this many trees, multiply that up, job done. That's not that great, because if there's loads of water in that material, it doesn't give you an idea of it's quick and it's easy, doesn't give you an idea of the actual energy value there. Okay, so often what happens is small samples of the different tissues are taken, dried out. Obviously this is destructive sampling. Okay, so it's often done using small samples that may not be representative. Okay, so the units for this, grams per meter squared. So how many grams of biomass are there for a given area of land, of an environment? Okay, how do we measure this then? Now this is, again, on your syllabus, this is a calorimeter. Now this verges more into biochemistry. You may well know this if you do chemistry. Calorimetry, you've probably been doing it since Key Stage 3 in a simple phrase, where if you ever got that experiment where you grab a hula hoop in some tongs, set it on fire and stick it under a boiling tube and it heats the water up, that's calorimetry. You're basically trying to measure the energy in a material by burning it. Okay, so chemical energy stored in dry mass can be estimated using this thing called calorimetry. If 1 gram of water is raised by 1 degree, you should remember the specific heat capacity of water. Yeah, that's at 4.2 idea, right? Joules per gram per degree, which gives us an idea of how much energy was in that sample. Now, obviously, there's some problems with this. We'll come back to that in a moment. So the temperature change, and if you know your temperature and you know your mass of water, you can work out an approximate energy value. And the units for that are kilojoules per kilogram. So how many kilojoules per kilogram of material. So you can then get nice big compound things where you can work out the energy value of an entire forest or an entire ecosystem in kilojoules per kilogram per meter squared. So if you're trying to work out how much energy a forest grows by per year, you might get kilojoules per kilogram per meter squared per year. Compound units like that. And just like in physics, there are some mean A-level questions that ask you to work with those complex units. Okay? So, in terms of limitations, right, this is what we call a bomb calorimeter. It's the best way to, it's the best one we've got. But in terms of limitations of this process, well, you need to really make sure that you're drying your material out. And drying is really boring. You've got these sort of low temperature ovens, you set them to 70, 80 degrees, and you put your sample in there. You've got to leave it for days and days and days. And you're measuring the mass, measuring the mass, measuring the mass, measuring the mass. So the mass falls, mass falls, mass falls, water evaporates off. And when the mass doesn't fall anymore, you know that it's dry. And you've got to leave it there for a long time to be sure you don't get a little bit more water coming out. And the temptation, of course, is, well, I'll go home, I'll turn the oven up a bit. But as soon as you get past 90, 100, well, you're just burning it and you're doing combustion. So you're actually losing mass by burning the sample. Okay, and that's one limitation of this experiment that's often pointed out in questions. You've also got incomplete combustion. When you burn the crisp or burn the hula hoop, if you did that practical, you didn't end up with nothing. You ended up with a little end of burnt hula hoop. There's still energy in that, but you just couldn't get it to burn because you couldn't hold it with the tweezers. Okay? You've also got heat escaping into the surroundings. Okay, you're saying, well, all this heat has somehow miraculously transferred from the hula hoop into the water, or from my sample into the water. Now we all know that heat transfers aren't 100% efficient, in fact, very, very far from it. So that doesn't give you a good idea of an accurate number. Okay, and of course then when you're heating a boiling tube to heat water, well, the first thing you heat is the boiling tube. So you heat the boiling tube, which heats the water, which then registers on the thermometer. So you've got a lot of that energy has been used to heat the equipment rather than to heat the water to give you a reading. Now this here is called a bomb calorimeter. It's the best thing we've got, sort of the most accurate thing we've got. So your sample goes in the middle there, in the yellow bit there, in the little sample cage, and that is usually charged with a lot of oxygen. The reason for that is to try and reduce incomplete combustion. So it's called a bomb calorimeter. Charge it up with oxygen so the reaction's really fast, really explosive. Okay, and it's surrounded, this chamber is completely surrounded by the water, which minimises the escape. Okay, you've got an ignition box, literally a spark, but once you've got that fuel in there in a highly oxygenated environment, just a single spark will set the whole thing off. And then you've got your temperature probe in there. We've got a stirrer so that we don't end up with the water around the container being really hot and the water further away being cold. But again, that causes friction, doesn't it? So there's going to be friction in that system, which might add a little heat to the system in there. Okay, these are all limitations of the process. So that is basically what we need to cover today. All right, so here's our summary of all the key terms I reckon you've got, and it is a lot. This is a wordy lesson, all right, which obviously is hard, but they are a lot of the words you will already know. So we've got ecosystem, habitat, population, community, herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, detritivore, producer, primary, secondary, tertiary, consumer, trophic level, food chain, food web, biomass, dry mass, chemical potential energy, calorimetry, which is the study that we just talked about, and calorimeter, which is the piece of equipment. Okay, and then if you're aiming for an A star, you might have picked up what trophic means, that sort of level, that idea of trophic, and autotroph, meaning self-producing, phototroph, using sunlight, heterotroph, gets their food from other trophic levels. Okay, so those are the words. Make sure you've made your summary and do have a look at some of the exam questions to get yourself practiced on this, and I'll see you next time.